The Comstock Lode, discovered beneath Mount Davidson in western Nevada in 1859, was the first major silver strike in the history of the United States and remains the largest deposit of high-grade silver ore ever found in North America. In 20 years, it produced more than $300 million in bullion, enough at the time to reshape the monetary policy of continental Europe. The wealth it generated built San Francisco's grandest buildings, financed the Union cause during the Civil War, and created the fortunes of men whose names still mark the streets and institutions of two states. But the Comstock did not distribute its wealth evenly, and it did not leave gently. It consumed 80% of the forests around Lake Tahoe, killed hundreds of miners in tunnels where the water reached boiling temperature, and drove the founder of the West's most important bank to drown himself in San Francisco Bay one day after his empire collapsed. This is the story of what the silver cost. 16 years before the Bank of California shuttered its doors and its founder entered the water for the last time, the eastern slope of Mount Davidson was empty ground. Sagebrush, rock, and the faint traces of placer gold had drawn a thin scattering of prospectors to a drainage called Gold Canyon. The land was not yet Nevada. It was the western edge of Utah territory, and it interested almost no one. The gold deposits in Gold Canyon were real but modest. A party of Mormons, blocked by winter from crossing the Sierra Nevada on their way to the California goldfields in 1850, had camped along the Carson River and panned enough to survive on half an ounce to an ounce per day. That was subsistence, not fortune. Over the following decade, a loose population of drifters, failed 49ers, and small-time prospectors worked the canyon's creeks and washes, earning enough to stay and not enough to leave. Two brothers named Ethan and Hosea Grosh came closer than anyone to understanding what lay beneath the surface. By 1857, the Grosh brothers had identified silver ore in the canyon and had begun mapping what they believed was a major deposit. They told almost no one. Then Hosea died of blood poisoning from a pick wound to his foot, and Ethan, attempting to cross the Sierra before winter to file claims in California, was caught in a blizzard, suffered frostbite so severe that both legs were amputated below the knee, and died in a cabin near Last Chance, California, in December of 1857. Their notes, their maps, and their knowledge of the silver died with them. The lode would wait 2 more years to be found by men less careful and less learned. Among those who remained in Gold Canyon were 2 Irishmen, Peter O'Reilly and Patrick McLaughlin, and a Canadian named Henry Thomas Page Comstock, known to his neighbors as Old Pancake because he could not be bothered to bake bread. In June of 1859, O'Reilly and McLaughlin struck gold at the head of 6 Mile Canyon, a genuine find, richer than anything Gold Canyon had produced. Comstock appeared almost immediately. He had not done the digging, but he was a fast talker with a loud voice, and he insisted the ground was his. O'Reilly and McLaughlin, for reasons that remain unclear, believed him. The claim became Comstock's, and his name attached itself to the lode that would shortly make the discovery of gold irrelevant. The gold was not the prize. Beneath it and around it lay a heavy blue-gray clay that clung to picks and shovels and made the miners curse. The blue stuff was everywhere, fouling the sluices, clogging the equipment, slowing the work. For weeks, the prospectors treated it as waste. Then someone, and the historical record does not agree on who, sent a sample across the Sierra to an assayer in Nevada City, California. The assay came back at 3/4 pure silver and 1/4 gold, valued at nearly $4,000 per ton. The blue stuff was not waste. It was the richest silver ore ever found on the continent. The news traveled fast. By the autumn of 1859, men were pouring over the Sierra from California. Thousands of them were veterans of the gold rush who had arrived too late for the best claims and had spent the intervening decade scraping marginal ground. The Washoe Rush, as it came to be called, reversed the flow of migration that had moved westward since 1849. Now the current ran east, back over the mountains, into a landscape of sagebrush and volcanic rock that bore no resemblance to the green foothills the 49ers remembered. Among the earliest arrivals was a 39-year-old Missourian named George Hearst. Hearst had left his family's farm at the age of 30 to join the gold rush, had spent nearly a decade prospecting and dealing in quartz mines around Grass Valley and Nevada City, and had developed a reputation as perhaps the finest natural judge of mineral ground on the Pacific Slope. When word of the blue stuff reached California, Hearst moved quickly. He sold his interest in the Lecompton mine near Nevada City and crossed the Sierra to examine the Washoe diggings for himself. What Hearst found confirmed what the assay had promised. He purchased a 1/6 interest in the Ophir mine, one of the richest of the early Comstock claims, for approximately $300. That winter, Hearst and his partners extracted 38 tons of high-grade silver ore from the Ophir, loaded it onto mules, and packed it across the Sierra Nevada to San Francisco, where it was smelted into bars of silver bullion. The profit was $91,000. In the currency of the time, it was enough to finance a mining empire, roughly equivalent to $2.5 million a century and a half later. The sight of those Ophir silver bars in San Francisco did what the assayer's report alone could not. It made the Comstock real. The rush that followed dwarfed anything the initial discovery had produced. Within months, the eastern slope of Mount Davidson was covered with tents, shacks, saloons, and the wooden frames of mines sinking into the hillside. A settlement called Virginia City became the most important city between Denver and San Francisco. The name itself was contested, attributed in some accounts to the state and in others to a hard-drinking prospector known as Old Virginie, who had reportedly christened the site by accidentally breaking a bottle of whiskey on the ground. By 1860, Virginia City's population had reached 2,300. By 1870, it was 7,000. By 1880, nearly 11,000 people lived on the eastern slope of a mountain in the Nevada desert, sustained entirely by the silver beneath their feet. The city had hotels, churches, an opera house, a half-dozen newspapers, and a young journalist from Missouri named Samuel Clemens, who had tried his hand at mining, failed at it, and taken a job at the Territorial Enterprise, where he began writing under a pen name, Mark Twain. Twain would later describe the newsroom's daily work as the manufacture of slaughter and mutilation for the public breakfast, and in this he was not entirely joking. Virginia City in the early 1860s was a place that consumed men and material at a rate commensurate with the wealth it produced. Saloons outnumbered churches by a ratio that no census bothered to record. The streets were unpaved, the buildings wooden, and the hillside so steep that the back wall of one structure stood level with the roof of the one below it. Fire was an inevitability everyone acknowledged and no one prepared for. The population was a compressed catalogue of the 19th century world. Irish and Cornish miners worked the deep shafts. Chinese laborers built the flumes and washed the tailings. German and French merchants ran the supply houses. Paiute people, whose ancestral territory this was, watched the mountain being hollowed from the margins of a city that had materialized on their land without negotiation or compensation. The early fortunes were made and lost with brutal speed. Comstock himself sold his claim for $11,000 and left the territory, drifting to Oregon and then to Montana, prospecting without success, drinking steadily. O'Reilly and McLaughlin sold for $20,000 apiece. These were not trivial sums in 1860, but they were fractions of what the ground would produce, and the men who accepted them would live long enough to understand the magnitude of what they had given away. A prospector named James Finney, known as Old Virginie, the man who may have given the city its name, died in June of 1861 after falling from a horse while drunk. He was described by those who knew him as a hard drinker when he could get the liquor and an indifferent worker at anything. The Comstock was generous with ore and indifferent to the men who found it. The ore was too deep, the geology too complex, and the extraction too expensive for men working with picks and hand-operated hoists. The small miners were being pushed out, not by the mountain, but by the cost of reaching what the mountain held. Square-set timbering, a honeycomb technique that braced mine shafts against cave-ins using interlocking wooden frames, had to be invented on the Comstock because no existing method could hold tunnels open at the depths the silver demanded. Pumps were needed to drain underground rivers of scalding water. Hoisting works powered by steam had to be built on the surface to lift ore and men from depths that would eventually exceed 3,000 feet. In the first 6 years of the Comstock, from 1859 to 1865, an estimated $50 million in ore came out of the ground. 20% of that went to litigation. Claim disputes, boundary wars, and courtroom battles enriched the lawyers and bled the prospectors. The technology required to mine at depth, the ventilation, pumping, timbering, and hoisting, was beyond the capital of any individual miner. The Comstock demanded industrial-scale investment. It demanded a bank. The silver was proven. The men who had found it were already falling away, selling out, drinking, wandering to the next strike. The men who would profit from it were 300 miles to the west, in a city that was itself only 15 years old, built on gold rush money, and ambitious enough to believe it deserved more. San Francisco was watching the Comstock, and in a brick building on Sansom Street, a banker named William Chapman Ralston was already calculating what the silver could build. William Chapman Ralston was not a miner. He was born in Wellsville, Ohio, on the banks of the Ohio River in 1826, the son of a keelboat builder, and he had learned early that the surest profits belonged not to the men who dug the ore, but to the men who moved the money. By the age of 23, he had worked his way from store clerk to steamboat clerk to junior partner in a shipping firm that exploited the gold rush traffic across the Isthmus of Panama. He arrived in San Francisco in 1854, a city barely 5 years removed from its incarnation as a Spanish mission village, and he recognized immediately that the place needed capital more than it needed gold. Within a decade, he would control more capital than any other financier west of the Mississippi River. The men who borrowed from him called him a visionary. The men who lost to him called him other things. On the 2nd of July, 1864, Ralston founded the Bank of California at the corner of Sansome and California Streets in San Francisco. For the titular head of the institution, he enlisted Darius Ogden Mills, the most respected financier on the Pacific Coast, a man whose name lent credibility to any venture it touched. Mills was president. Ralston, as cashier, actually ran the bank. The arrangement suited both men. Mills provided respectability. Ralston provided appetite. The Comstock Lode was 5 years old and already straining against its own success. The easy surface ore was gone. The deep ore required machinery, timbering, ventilation, and pumping systems that cost more than most claim holders could afford. Miners who had borrowed against future production were falling behind on their payments. The Comstock needed a lender. Ralston needed a mine. The timing was deliberate. By 1864, the Comstock had already demonstrated its strategic value to the federal government. The silver pouring out of Nevada had helped finance the Union cause during the Civil War, and Republican leaders in Washington, eager to add another loyal state to their column, had used the Lode's promise of future population growth to justify the admission of Nevada as the 36th state on the 31st of October, 1864, just 8 days before the presidential election. Nevada's constitution was telegraphed to Washington in the longest and most expensive telegram in American history. The state existed because of the silver, and the silver existed because of the capital that men like Ralston were prepared to extend. The dependency ran in both directions. Ralston sent William Sharon to Virginia City. To call Sharon a banker would be to describe the scope of his work too narrowly. Sharon was a stock jobber, a real estate speculator, and a political operator who had failed at multiple ventures in San Francisco before Ralston offered him the Virginia City agency of the Bank of California. He was thin, cold-eyed, and precise in his cruelties. He arrived on the Comstock in 1864 with instructions to extend credit to the struggling mine operators, and he executed those instructions with a thoroughness that the operators would not fully appreciate until it was too late. The method was simple and repeatable. Sharon loaned money to mine owners at rates they could service only as long as the ore held. When the ore thinned, or the pumps failed, or the litigation consumed the profits, the owners fell behind. Sharon foreclosed. The mine passed to the Bank of California. He moved through the Comstock's claim holders the way a careful farmer moves through a field at harvest, taking each one at the moment of maximum ripeness and minimum resistance. Within 5 years, the bank controlled a majority of the producing mines on the Comstock Lode, not because it had discovered anything, but because it had waited for the discoverers to exhaust themselves. But the mines alone were not enough. Sharon understood that the real leverage lay in controlling everything around the mines. He acquired the stamping mills that processed the ore so that independent mine owners who still held their claims had no choice but to pay the bank's milling fees. He took control of the Virginia and Gold Hill Water Company, the only reliable source of water on the arid mountainside, so that every boiler, every household, and every fire hose in Virginia City depended on the bank's infrastructure. And in 1869, with Ralston's capital behind him, Sharon built the Virginia and Truckee Railroad, connecting Virginia City to Carson City, and from there to the Central Pacific Line at Reno. The railroad was an engineering achievement of considerable ambition, descending 1,600 feet in elevation over 21 miles of track through some of the most difficult terrain in the Great Basin. It reduced the cost of hauling ore from the mines to the mills in the Carson River Valley below. It also eliminated the independent teamsters and freight haulers who had previously competed for the business. The railroad did not merely serve the Comstock, it completed the Bank of California's control of it. Every route by which wealth left the mountain now passed through the bank's ledgers. Sharon adroitly devoured mines, mills, business associates, transportation, forests, and Virginia City's water supply. He directed the profits back to his partners in what Virginia City residents had begun to call the bank crowd. There was, however, one man on the Comstock whom Sharon could not absorb. An Irish immigrant named John Mackay had arrived in 1859 from the California goldfields, had worked as a common miner in the early shafts, and had slowly accumulated enough capital to acquire small claims of his own. Mackay was not a speculator. He was a geologist by instinct, a man who understood rock the way Ralston understood credit, and he had concluded that the Comstock's richest ore had not yet been found. Sharon dismissed him. That dismissal would prove to be the most expensive miscalculation in the history of Nevada mining, though its consequences would not arrive for another 4 years. Sharon manipulated the San Francisco Mining Exchange with the advantage of information no outside investor could match. He knew which tunnels were producing and which were flooding. He knew when a new vein had been struck and when an old one had pinched out. He passed this intelligence to Ralston, and together they bought and sold Comstock mining stocks ahead of the public, banking the difference between what the shares were worth and what the market believed they were worth. The practice was not, in the legal framework of the 1860s, a crime. It was simply the way men of means conducted business on the frontier of American finance. The men and women of modest means who bought Comstock shares on the San Francisco Exchange, believing the published reports from the mine heads, had no way of knowing that the reports were shaped by the same hands that traded on their contents. The losses, when they came, were absorbed individually and in silence. The profits were consolidated and reinvested. 300 miles to the west, Ralston converted the River of Silver into a San Francisco empire. The list of his investments reads less like a portfolio than like the infrastructure of a city being assembled by a single will. He built the California Theater on Bush Street, the grandest performance hall on the Pacific Coast. He invested in woolen and silk mills, in a furniture factory, in a watch company, in a carriage works. He financed canal companies, insurance firms, gas works, and refineries. He bought an interest in the Alaska Commercial Company, which held a monopoly on the Alaskan fur seal trade. He was a founding investor in the Cornell Watch Company and the Pacific Woolen Mills. He lobbied Congress for irrigation in the San Joaquin Valley. He discussed the design of Golden Gate Park with Frederick Law Olmsted. His estate at Belmont, south of San Francisco, was a 42-acre property with crystal chandeliers, silver-plated doorknobs, a Turkish bath, a bowling alley, stables with mahogany stalls inlaid with mother-of-pearl, and a private gasworks that supplied fuel to the neighboring village. Visitors called it the White House of the West. Ralston's hospitality was itself an instrument of leverage. His dinner table seated men whose decisions shaped legislation, railroad routes, mining law, and municipal contracts. A confidential letter from Ralston to Sharon, preserved in the historical record, advised his partner to go easy on a wealthy associate who owned stock they wanted. The tone was that of a man who understood that social grace and financial coercion were two faces of the same coin, and that the dinner invitation and the foreclosure notice could arrive in the same week from the same office. By the early 1870s, Ralston had conceived his grandest project, the Palace Hotel, to be built at the corner of New Montgomery and Market Streets in San Francisco. The architect, John Gaynor, had been instructed to study the luxury hotels of Europe and surpass them. The building would occupy an entire city block. It would have 7 stories, 800 rooms, hydraulic elevators, electric call buttons, and an interior court large enough for a horse-drawn carriage to turn. The projected cost was $5 million, a figure that Ralston's partners considered reckless, and that Ralston himself considered merely ambitious. The Palace Hotel would open on the 2nd of October, 1875. William Ralston would not be alive to see it. He would drown in San Francisco Bay 5 weeks before the doors opened, on the day after his bank collapsed, having signed over every asset he possessed to the board that demanded his resignation. His partner, William Sharon, would acquire the hotel at a fraction of its cost. The palace would survive the 1806 earthquake, but burn in the fire that followed. It would be rebuilt and would stand into the next century, its Ralston room named for the man who had financed it with money he did not have, drawn from a bank he no longer controlled against silver that was already beginning to thin inside the mountain. But in 1871, the collapse was still 4 years away, and Ralston had no reason to doubt the permanence of what he had built. The Bank of California controlled the Comstock. Sharon controlled Virginia City. The silver moved through the bank's ledgers in orderly columns, and the profits flowed west to San Francisco, where they became theaters and hotels and estates with mother-of-pearl stalls. On the mountain itself, the arithmetic was different. The men who descended each morning into the shafts beneath Virginia City worked in conditions that the ledgers in San Francisco did not record, and that the silver bars in the bank's vaults did not reflect. The shafts beneath Virginia City descended into the earth at angles and depths that had no precedent in American mining. By the late 1860s, the deepest workings had passed 1,000 feet. By the mid-1870s, they would reach 2,000 feet. By 1884, the Ophir Mexican Winze would touch 3,360 feet below the surface of Mount Davidson, a depth at which the rock itself was hot to the touch, and the air carried the sulphurous weight of the planet's interior. The heat was the first problem the miners encountered, and the last one anyone solved. At 1,500 feet, the temperature in the tunnels reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. At 2,000 feet, it exceeded 120 degrees. At 3,000 feet, miners worked 15-minute shifts, stripped to loincloths, pouring ice water over their heads between rounds of drilling. The Comstock mines consumed 95 pounds of ice per man per day at the deepest levels. Hoisting engineers on the surface operated the cages that carried men up and down the shafts, and the men in those cages understood that the engineers' concentration was the only barrier between a controlled descent and a free fall into darkness. Cave-ins were routine. Underground fires, fed by the timber that held the tunnels open, could seal off entire levels for weeks. The workforce was drawn from every corner of the industrializing world. Irish miners, many of them veterans of the copper and tin mines of County Cork, made up the largest single group and dominated the underground crews. Cornish miners from southwest England brought hard rock techniques refined over generations in the tin and copper country of their homeland. German engineers designed the hoisting works and the ventilation systems. Chinese laborers, barred by both custom and periodic violence from the underground shafts, worked the surface operations, the tailings piles, the ore sorting stations, the flumes and wood yards. They were paid less, housed separately, and subjected to restrictions that would harden, over the following decade, into formal exclusion laws. The Comstock's wealth was cosmopolitan in its origins. Its distribution was not. And then there was the water. The water beneath Mount Davidson was not the cool seepage of an ordinary mine. It was superheated by geothermal forces, pressurized by the weight of the rock above it, and when a drill or a pick punctured the wrong seam, it did not trickle. It exploded. Miners were scalded to death in their own tunnels. Others drowned in shafts that filled faster than the pumps could clear them. The pumps themselves were marvels of desperate engineering, massive Cornish-style engines imported at enormous cost, capable of lifting thousands of gallons per minute from the lower levels to the surface. The water they expelled was too hot to touch and carried with it the dissolved minerals of the lode itself, staining everything. It reached a deep ochre. A Prussian-born engineer named Adolf Sutro proposed a solution in 1865. He would drive a horizontal tunnel nearly 4 miles long from the floor of the Carson River Valley into the base of the Comstock Lode at a depth of approximately 1,600 feet. The tunnel would drain the lower levels of the mines by gravity. eliminating the need for the most expensive pumping operations. It would also provide ventilation, reducing the heat that killed and incapacitated miners by the score. Sutro lobbied Congress, sold stock to European investors, and fought the Bank of California at every turn because Ralston and Sharon understood that the Sutro Tunnel would break their monopoly on the infrastructure that kept the mines running. The bank funded opposition newspapers, pressured legislators, and attempted to starve the project of capital. Sutro persisted. Construction began in 1869. The main bore was completed in 1878, 9 years and $3.5 million later. By then, the richest ore had already been extracted from the levels the tunnel was designed to serve. The tunnel drained the mines, but the bonanza it was built to sustain had already peaked. Sutro sold his interest, moved to San Francisco, and was elected mayor in 1894. He died nearly broke. But the most visible wound the Comstock inflicted was not underground. It was on the surface, and it stretched across an entire mountain range. The square-set timbering system that held the Comstock's tunnels open was a genuine innovation, invented on the Lode by a German engineer named Philipp Deidesheimer in 1860. The technique used interlocking cubes of heavy timber stacked like a honeycomb to support the walls and ceilings of excavated chambers that would otherwise have collapsed under the weight of the mountain. It worked. It also consumed timber at a rate that had no parallel in the history of mining or construction. A single mine could require millions of board feet per year. The Comstock as a whole devoured forests the way the pumps devoured water, constantly and without limit. The nearest source of timber was the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, and in particular the forests surrounding Lake Tahoe, 30 miles to the west. Within a decade of the Comstock's discovery, logging crews had cut roads into the Tahoe Basin, erected sawmills on its shores, and begun the systematic removal of old-growth pine and fir that had taken centuries to reach maturity. V-shaped flumes, engineered from heavy planking and fed by diverted mountain streams, carried logs down the steep eastern face of the Sierra at speeds that made the timber business one of the most dangerous occupations on the Lode. The logs arrived in the Carson River Valley, were sawn into square-set dimensions, and hauled up to Virginia City by the Virginia and Truckee Railroad. The scale of the deforestation was absolute. An estimated 80% of the Lake Tahoe Basin's forests were clear-cut during the Comstock era. The hillsides above the lake, which had been dense with Jeffrey pine, sugar pine, and white fir for millennia, were stripped to bare soil. Erosion followed immediately. Sediment poured into streams that fed the lake, clouding water that had been among the clearest on the continent. The naturalist John Muir traveled up the Truckee River to Lake Tahoe in 1888 and found the ground littered with fallen burnt logs and the stripped tops of trees felled for lumber. The best timber, Muir observed, had been taken. What remained was damage. The forests that grew back were not the forests that had been cut. The old growth had been a mosaic of trees of various ages and sizes, thinned by periodic wildfire into open, resilient stands. The regrowth was dense, uniform, and vulnerable. Every tree in the new forest was the same age, competing for the same light and moisture, and without the periodic fires that had once kept the understory clear, ladder fuels accumulated to levels that would make the Tahoe Basin one of the most fire-prone landscapes in the American West more than a century later. The Comstock's timber hunger did not merely strip the mountains, it replaced an ancient ecology with a fragile one, and the consequences of that replacement have not yet finished arriving. On the 18th of October, 1875, the cost of building a city from wood on a desert mountainside came due. A fire that began in a lodging house on A Street in Virginia City, possibly from an overturned coal oil lamp, spread through the town with a speed that the wooden buildings, the dry autumn air, and the steady wind made inevitable. The volunteer fire companies fought it with water drawn from the same Virginia and Gold Hill Water Company that the Bank of California controlled. They were overwhelmed within the hour. By morning, nearly 75% of Virginia City had burned. The damage was estimated at $12 million. 2,000 people were homeless. Piper's Opera House, the International Hotel, churches, saloons, and block after block of commercial buildings were reduced to ash and stone foundations. The town rebuilt in 18 months, using more timber from the same Sierra forests, raising structures on the same ground from the same material with the same vulnerability to the same fire. The lesson, such as it was, went unlearned. Through it all, the silver continued to flow. The bank crowd controlled the ledgers, the railroad hauled the ore, and the pumps held back the boiling water. The miners descended, worked their 15-minute shifts in the heat, and rode the cages back to the surface. The forests fell, the flumes ran, and the sawmills filled the valley with a fine pale dust that settled on everything. The system was brutal, efficient, and, as long as the ore held, self-sustaining. The $4-a-day wages paid to the miners underground were the highest in the American mining industry, and the Comstock's labor unions were among the first organized in the West. The money was good. The work was a form of slow ruin that the money did not fully compensate. Miners who survived the heat, the water, and the cave-ins emerged with damaged lungs, wrecked joints, and a tolerance for risk that the gambling houses and saloons of C Street were designed to absorb. The mountain gave, and the mountain took, and the men who profited most from the exchange lived in San Francisco, 300 miles from the shafts. But the bank crowd's hold on the Comstock was not as permanent as Ralston and Sharon believed. The OR did not hold forever in the places where they expected to find it. And in a set of claims that Sharon had dismissed as worthless ground, 4 men who had begun their American lives in poverty were about to prove him wrong on a scale that would rewrite the financial history of the West. John William Mackay was born in Dublin on the 28th of November, 1831, into a family that lived in a dirt-floored hovel shared with a pig. In 1840, the Mackays emigrated to the Five Points neighborhood of Lower Manhattan, a district that held the distinction of being the most densely packed and most impoverished slum in the Western Hemisphere. His father died shortly after the crossing. Mackay grew up working. He had no formal education past the age of 12, no inheritance, no family connections, and no capital. By the time he was 19, he had apprenticed as a shipbuilder and saved enough to buy passage to California when word of the gold rush reached New York. He arrived in 1851. He did not find gold. What Mackay found instead was an education in rock. He spent 8 years in the California diggings, learning to read geological formations with a precision that university-trained mining engineers would later acknowledge but never quite replicate. He understood fault lines, ore bodies, the way veins pinched and widened, the signals that the rock gave before it yielded or refused. When the Comstock Rush began in 1859, Mackay crossed the Sierra Nevada and went to work as a common miner in the shafts of Virginia City, earning $4 a day. He saved what he earned, observed the geology around him, and waited. By the late 1860s, Mackay had accumulated enough capital from a series of small, well-chosen investments to begin acquiring claims of his own. He partnered with James Graham Fair, a fellow Irishman who had been born in County Tyrone in 1831. and who had worked his way up from laborer to mine superintendent on the Comstock. Fair was a meticulous underground manager, a man who understood the engineering of deep mining the way Mackay understood its geology. Together they formed one half of a partnership that would become the most consequential alliance in the history of American mining. The other half operated 300 miles to the west. James Clare Flood had been born in New York in 1826 to Irish immigrant parents, had arrived in San Francisco during the gold rush, and after brief unprofitable attempts at mining and carpentry, had opened a saloon with William S. O'Brien on Washington Street. The Auction Lunch Saloon was located in the heart of San Francisco's financial district, and its clientele included miners, speculators, brokers, and men who held information about the Comstock that they shared freely over whiskey. Flood, who had an 8th-grade education and a memory for numbers that bordered on absolute, listened. O'Brien, who had been born in County Lower, Ireland, and had arrived in San Francisco as one of the original 49ers, listened with him. Together they absorbed more intelligence about the state of the Comstock mines than most investors could assemble from published reports. They sold the saloon, opened a brokerage, and began trading in mining stocks with an information advantage that their position on the exchange floor steadily compounded. Around 1871, the four men found each other. Mackay and Fair had the mining knowledge. Flood and O'Brien had the capital and the market instincts. All four were Irish, all four had arrived in America poor, and all four understood that the bank crowd's grip on the Comstock was not as complete as it appeared. There were claims on the lode that the Bank of California had passed over, ground that Sharon had examined and rejected, sections of the vein where exploratory tunnels had produced nothing and where the stock had fallen to prices that invited contempt. The Consolidated Virginia Mining Company was one such property. It occupied a stretch of the Comstock Lode between the Ophir and the Best and Belcher mines, a section that had already consumed more than $1 million in fruitless exploration. Sharon regarded it as dead ground. He was glad to let the four Irishmen take it off his hands. The purchase price was approximately $100,000. The original stock issue was 10,700 shares, trading between $4 and $5 each. In the broader context of the Comstock, where individual mines had been valued in the tens of millions, it was a negligible sum. Flood and O'Brien raised the money. Mackay and Fair went underground. For more than a year, the four partners poured money into tunnels that produced nothing. They dug laterally, vertically, and at angles dictated by Mackay's reading of the fault structures beneath Mount Davidson. Mackay spent weeks at a time underground, examining the rock faces personally, mapping the faults by candlelight in shafts where the temperature made sustained thought an act of physical endurance. He was not speculating. He was reading the mountain the way a surgeon reads an anatomy, and what he read told him that the Comstock's deepest and richest ore body lay in precisely the section of the lode that the bank crowd's engineers had abandoned. The work was expensive, the results discouraging, and the San Francisco Press, which covered the Comstock with the attentiveness of a society columnist, treated the venture as a slow-motion waste of capital. Sharon watched with satisfaction. The four Irishmen, he believed, were burying their money in rock that would never repay it. In the autumn of 1873, at a depth of 1,167 feet, Mackay and Fair noticed a thin vein of silver in one of their lateral tunnels. They pushed their crews deeper. The vein disappeared and reappeared. It widened. At 1,200 feet, the miners broke into an ore body 54 feet across and descending more than 400 feet into the earth. It was the largest and richest single deposit of silver and gold ever found in North America. The Big Bonanza, as it came to be called, was not merely a rich strike. It was a geological event of a magnitude that altered the financial structure of the American West. Mackay and Fair wired Flood and O'Brien in San Francisco with instructions to buy every available share of Consolidated Virginia stock before the news became public. Flood executed the orders with the speed and discretion of a man who had spent years learning the rhythms of the exchange floor. By the time the discovery was announced, the four partners controlled enough stock to ensure that the Bonanza's profits would flow to them and not to the speculators who had dismissed the ground as worthless. The numbers that followed were of a kind that the financial markets of the 1870s had no framework to absorb. The Consolidated Virginia paid dividends of $1 million per month for 3 years. The partners acquired the adjacent California mine, which proved to be an extension of the same ore body, and that property produced at a comparable rate. The original stock issue of 10,700 shares was converted into 2 issues of 108,000 shares each. By the middle of 1875, the speculative value of the Consolidated Virginia and the California mine together approached $1 billion. Individual shares traded as high as $710. The 4 men who had purchased the property for $100,000 were now among the wealthiest human beings on the planet. San Francisco lost its mind. Montgomery Street, already the financial center of the West, became a continuous open-air exchange in which barbers, housemaids, hotel clerks, and retired sea captains traded Comstock mining stocks alongside professional brokers. The San Francisco Stock and Exchange Board, founded in 1862, handled volumes of trading that rivaled the New York Stock Exchange. Chinese gambling houses on DuPont Street closed for lack of customers, their clientele having migrated to the more volatile and potentially more rewarding game of silver speculation. The fever was not limited to the wealthy. Working men pledged their savings. Widows pledged their homes. Servants invested their wages on tips overheard at their employers' dinner tables. A seamstress who had never seen a share certificate could recite the closing price of Consolidated Virginia stock from memory. The newspapers published daily reports of share prices alongside news from the mine heads, and the 2 streams of information fed a cycle of speculation that was, for a time, indistinguishable from optimism. For every dollar the Big Bonanza produced in ore, the San Francisco Exchange produced $10 in speculative valuation, and the distance between those 2 numbers was a debt that the city had not yet been asked to pay. The Bonanza Kings, as the press now called them, used their wealth to challenge the bank crowd directly. Flood and O'Brien established the Nevada Bank of San Francisco in 1875, capitalized with Comstock silver, as a direct competitor to Ralston's Bank of California. The move was deliberate. For more than a decade, the Bank of California had controlled the flow of Comstock capital. The Nevada Bank broke that monopoly. The 2 institutions now competed for deposits, for loans, for influence over the mining stocks that drove the city's economy, and the competition was personal. Ralston and Sharon had built their empire on the assumption that no rival could accumulate enough capital to challenge them. The Big Bonanza had produced exactly that capital, and it had placed it in the hands of men who owed the bank crowd nothing and feared it less. The confrontation between the bank crowd and the Bonanza Kings was not a matter of abstract financial theory. It was a war conducted through stock prices, newspaper columns, legislative favors, and the quiet acquisition of shares in each other's properties. It was fought on the floor of the San Francisco Exchange, and in the boardrooms of Montgomery Street, and in the tunnels beneath Virginia City, where the question of how much ore remained in the Big Bonanza was the single most consequential uncertainty in American finance. Sharon, who had spent a decade as the unchallenged master of the Comstock, found himself outmaneuvered by men he had regarded as laborers and saloon keepers. Ralston, in San Francisco, watched his bank's monopoly dissolve and responded not by retreating, but by extending himself further, borrowing against assets that were themselves borrowed against silver that was itself an estimate of what the mountain might still contain. The chain of leverage grew longer and thinner with each month. By the summer of 1875, the answer to the question that sustained the entire structure was beginning to take shape. The richest levels of the Big Bonanza had been mined. The ore was thinning. The dividends, while still enormous, had begun to slow. And the speculative fever that had inflated Comstock stock prices to levels unmoored from the ore beneath them had created a structure of debt and expectation that required the silver to continue flowing at a rate the mountain could no longer sustain. The reckoning was weeks away. It would begin not in the tunnels of the Consolidated Virginia, but in the marble lobby of the Bank of California on Sansom Street, and it would end in the cold water of San Francisco Bay. The structure that William Ralston had built required one condition to sustain itself. The silver had to keep flowing. Not merely flowing, but flowing at a rate sufficient to justify the debts he had accumulated, the ventures he had financed, the hotel he was building, and the confidence of the depositors whose money he had quietly redirected into his own investments. By the summer of 1875, that condition was no longer being met. The panic of 1873 had already weakened the national economy. Railroad overspeculation in the East had triggered a cascade of bank failures, business closures, and unemployment that reached the Pacific coast in delayed but devastating waves. Demand for silver on the international market had softened as European nations, led by newly unified Germany, began abandoning silver-based currencies in favor of the gold standard. The price of silver, which had seemed as permanent as the metal itself, began to fall. On the Comstock, the richest levels of the Big Bonanza were thinning. Production from the Consolidated Virginia and the California Mine, while still substantial, had peaked in 1877 and was now trending downward. The speculative valuations that had inflated Comstock stocks to a collective $1 billion bore less and less resemblance to the ore that remained in the ground. Ralston's exposure was catastrophic. He had financed the Palace Hotel at a cost that exceeded $5 million, and the building was not yet open. He had purchased the Spring Valley Water Company, which supplied San Francisco's domestic water, in a speculative gamble that the city would buy the system from him at a premium. The city declined. He had invested in silk mills, woolen factories, furniture works, canal companies, and real estate ventures south of Market Street, each of them funded in part with money drawn, without the full knowledge of his board, from the Bank of California's deposits. The bank's reserves, which were supposed to back the obligations on its ledger, had been converted into bricks, timber, silk thread, and the polished marble of a hotel lobby that Ralston intended to be the finest room west of New York. William Sharon, who understood the arithmetic better than anyone, saw the collapse coming before it arrived. In the weeks preceding the crisis, Sharon quietly liquidated his Comstock stock holdings, selling into a market that was already nervous and accelerating its decline. Whether Sharon acted to protect his own position or to hasten Ralston's fall is a question the historical record does not resolve. The effect was the same. The selling triggered panic. Comstock share prices, which had been declining gradually, fell sharply. The depositors of the Bank of California, reading the stock tables and the increasingly alarmed coverage in the San Francisco newspapers, began to withdraw their funds. On the morning of the 26th of August, 1875, a crowd gathered outside the Bank of California on Sansom Street. The morning had begun like any other business day on Montgomery Street, but by mid-morning the line of depositors waiting to withdraw their funds had grown long enough to attract the attention of passers-by, and the passers-by, seeing the line, joined it. Panic, once it begins, requires no additional cause. The crowd grew through the morning. By early afternoon, depositors were pressing against the doors, demanding their money. The bank's tellers paid out what they could, counting gold and silver coin across the marble counters with a steadiness that concealed the desperation behind the partition. The cash reserves, already depleted by Ralston's diversion of funds into his personal ventures, evaporated. At 2:30 in the afternoon, the Bank of California closed its doors. The most important financial institution in the American West had failed. The news reached the San Francisco Stock and Exchange Board within minutes. Comstock stocks, already declining, collapsed. Fortunes that had existed on paper at 9 o'clock that morning ceased to exist by 3. The following day, the 27th of August, the bank's board of directors convened an emergency investigation. The audit revealed what Ralston's partners had suspected and what his depositors had feared. Millions of dollars in bank funds had been used to finance Ralston's personal empire. The investments were real, the assets tangible, but they were illiquid, unsaleable at anything approaching their cost, and they belonged to Ralston, not to the bank. The board demanded his resignation. Ralston complied immediately. He signed over every asset he possessed, his real estate, his stock holdings, the Belmont estate, his interest in the Palace Hotel, everything, to the bank's receivers. He pledged to make the depositors whole. Then he left the building. That afternoon, William Chapman Ralston walked from his offices to the shore at North Beach, a stretch of San Francisco waterfront where he had been accustomed to swim in the afternoons for years. He entered the water and swam toward Alcatraz Island, as was his habit. He did not return. His body was recovered from the bay later that evening. The coroner's report attributed the death to asphyxia by drowning. Whether the drowning was the result of a stroke suffered during the exertion, as his family maintained, or a deliberate act, as the historian Hubert Howe Bancroft and many of Ralston's contemporaries believed, has never been established with certainty. Bancroft, who had known Ralston personally, wrote in the margin of a city history that Ralston was a daring and dashing pet of the people, but a bad man who committed suicide rather than face his friends after his frauds became public. Approximately 50,000 people watched the funeral procession. 8,000 attended the memorial at Union Hall. The grief was genuine. Ralston had built theaters, financed parks, employed thousands, and entertained the city's elite with a generosity that blurred the line between philanthropy and self-promotion. The city mourned him as a visionary. The depositors mourned their savings. William Sharon moved quickly. He acquired the Palace Hotel, the Belmont estate, and a substantial portion of Ralston's remaining assets at prices that reflected the desperation of the bank's receivers rather than the value of the properties. When Sharon was shown Ralston's body, he reportedly offered a single assessment of his former partner's death. The words attributed to him, preserved in multiple period accounts, were among the coldest ever spoken over a dead man in San Francisco. Sharon said it was the best thing Ralston could have done. He then absorbed the assets and moved on. The Palace Hotel opened on the 2nd of October, 1875, 5 weeks and 5 days after its builder drowned. It had 800 rooms, hydraulic elevators, electric call buttons, and an interior court designed by the architect John Gaynor to impress visitors who had seen the grand hotels of Paris and Vienna. The opening was a triumph of engineering, and a monument to the fact that the line between ambition and ruin in 19th century San Francisco was measured in weeks, not years. The collapse of the Bank of California was the most prominent casualty of the Comstock's unwinding, but it was not the only one. The speculative fever that had driven Comstock stock prices to their peak had drawn in thousands of ordinary San Franciscans whose losses, individually small and collectively vast, were absorbed in silence. Men who had pledged their savings on the strength of stock tips from the exchange floor found their holdings worthless. Families who had mortgaged their homes to buy consolidated Virginia shares at $700 watched the price fall to fractions of its peak. The boarding houses of the South of Market District and the modest homes of the Mission filled with men and women who had gambled on the mountain and lost. The precise number of personal bankruptcies and suicides that followed the crash has never been calculated, because the losses were distributed among people whose names did not appear in the financial press, and whose deaths, when they occurred, were recorded without reference to the stocks that had precipitated them. The Comstock had created wealth on a scale that reshaped a city. It destroyed wealth on a scale that was, by design, invisible. The original discoverers of the Comstock had long since departed the story, but their endings were of a piece with the broader pattern. Henry Comstock, who had sold his claim for $11,000 and wandered to Oregon and then to Montana, shot himself in the head in a mining camp called Bozeman on the 27th of September, 1870. He was 49 years old and had spent the last decade of his life prospecting without success and drinking without restraint. Patrick McLaughlin, who had been among the first to strike gold at 6 Mile Canyon, ended his life as a cook on a sheep ranch in California, earning $40 a month. Peter O'Reilly, McLaughlin's partner in the original discovery, died in a state asylum in California. James Finney, Old Virginie, had been dead since 1861, killed by a fall from a horse after a night of drinking. Not one of the men who found the Comstock Lode lived to enjoy what it produced. The silver passed through their hands and into the hands of bankers, stock manipulators, railroad builders, and mine superintendents who arrived after the ore was proven and who understood that the real wealth of the Comstock lay not in the act of discovery but in the machinery of extraction. One of those men had understood this earlier and more completely than the rest. He had been present at the Comstock from its first winter, had packed the first Ophir silver across the Sierra Nevada on muleback, and had departed the Lode not as a broken man, but as a man with a method. By 1875, he was no longer in Virginia City. He was building something larger, something that would outlast the silver, the bank, and the mountain itself. His name was George Hearst, and the fortune he carried out of the Comstock would seed an empire that his son would make famous and that the 20th century would struggle to contain. George Hearst left the Comstock Lode in the early 1860s with two assets that no bankruptcy could diminish and no stock crash could erase. The first was money. The Ophir mine and his subsequent Comstock investments had made him wealthy by any measure of the era. The second, and more durable, was a method. Hearst had learned to read mineral ground with a fluency that formerly trained geologists acknowledged but could not replicate. He understood the signatures that rock gave before it yielded ore, the faults that channeled deposits, the surface indicators that separated a paying prospect from a hole in the ground. He had watched the Comstock consume the men who discovered it and enrich the men who controlled the machinery around it. He had absorbed both lessons. When he left Virginia City, he did not leave as a prospector hoping for the next strike. He left as an industrialist who understood that the value of a mine lay not in the ore alone, but in the system built to extract it. Hearst settled in San Francisco in the early 1860s, married a young woman from Missouri named Phoebe Apperson in 1862, and began applying his Comstock education to mining properties across the American West. His approach was methodical. He traveled constantly, examining prospects in person, descending into shafts, chipping samples from rock faces, and rendering judgments that mine owners and investors came to treat as verdicts. His fees for evaluation were high. His investments, when he chose to make them, were selective and strategic. He did not speculate. He identified properties with proven geology, acquired them at prices that reflected their current condition rather than their speculative potential, and built the infrastructure necessary to extract their value at industrial scale. In San Francisco, Hearst formed a partnership with two men who complemented his skills precisely. James Ben Ali Hagen was a Kentucky-born lawyer of Turkish and Irish descent who had made his fortune in Sacramento real estate and who understood the legal architecture of mining claims, water rights, and land title with a thoroughness that protected Hearst's investments from the litigation that had bled the Comstock's early claim holders. Lloyd Tevis, also a lawyer, brought connections to the railroad interests and banking houses that could supply the capital Hearst's ventures required. Together, the three men formed Hearst, Hagen, Tevis and Company. It would grow to become the largest private mining firm in the United States. The first major test of the partnership came in 1872, when a miner named Marcus Daly, whom Hearst knew from the Comstock, brought word of a silver prospect in Park City, Utah. The Ontario Mine, as it was called, required substantial investment to develop and carried the kind of risk that most investors in the depressed economy of the early 1870s were unwilling to accept. Hearst examined the property, judged the geology sound, and committed his capital. The Ontario carried Hearst through the panic of 1873, the same financial crisis that was weakening Ralston's empire 300 miles to the west. Over the following decade, the Ontario produced $17 million in silver. It was the investment that demonstrated to Hearst and his partners that the Comstock model, the identification and development of deep mineral deposits through systematic evaluation rather than speculative gambling, could be replicated across the continent. The next application of that model would be far larger, and its moral dimensions darker. In 1876, George Armstrong Custer led a military expedition into the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, land that had been guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux by the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The expedition confirmed the presence of gold in the region, and the news triggered a rush that the federal government made no serious effort to prevent. The treaty was effectively voided. The Lakota were driven from the hills by a combination of military force and the sheer weight of prospectors who followed the soldiers into the territory. Among those prospectors were men working for Hearst. They identified a massive low-grade gold deposit near the town of Lode in the northern hills. The ore was lean compared to the Comstock's silver, but the deposit was enormous, extending deeper and wider than anything previously found in the Western Hemisphere. Hearst purchased the claim, named it the Homestake Mine, and began building the infrastructure to extract gold from it at volumes that would compensate for the lower grade. The Lakota, whose sacred hills now hosted the largest gold mine on the continent, received nothing. The Homestake would become the largest and deepest gold mine on the North American continent. It produced gold continuously from 1877 until 2001, a span of 124 years. Over its lifetime, it yielded more than 40 million troy ounces of gold. At current valuations, that output would be measured in the tens of billions of dollars. Hearst listed it on the New York Stock Exchange in 1879, making it one of the first publicly traded mining stocks in American history. The mine did not merely produce wealth. It produced a permanent, self-sustaining revenue stream that freed the Hearst family from dependence on any single deposit, and that would finance the ambitions of the next 2 generations. In 1881, Marcus Daly brought Hearst another prospect, a copper mine in Butte, Montana, called the Anaconda. Hearst financed its development. The Anaconda would become one of the most productive copper mines in the world, feeding the demand for electrical wiring that the new century's industrialization would create. From the Comstock's silver to the Homestake's gold to the Anaconda's copper, Hearst had traced the arc of American industrial expansion through the metals that made it possible. George Hearst entered politics in the mid-1860s, serving a term in the California state legislature. He purchased a 48,000-acre cattle ranch along the coast at San Simeon in San Luis Obispo County, land that his son would later use as the site for the largest private residence in America. In 1886, the governor of California appointed him to fill a vacancy in the United States Senate. He was elected in his own right the following year and served until his death. He was, by all accounts, an awkward legislator, a man more comfortable examining a rock face at 2,000 feet than addressing a chamber of politicians in Washington. His reading ability remained limited throughout his life. His judgment in mineral matters remained unmatched. Around 1880, Hearst acquired the San Francisco Examiner, a struggling daily newspaper, as payment for a gambling debt owed to him by a Democratic political associate. The acquisition was incidental. Hearst had no particular interest in journalism and regarded the paper as a minor asset in a portfolio dominated by mines, ranches, and real estate. He could not have known that the Examiner would prove to be the most consequential investment of his life, not for what it earned, but for what it made possible. George Hearst's only child, William Randolph Hearst, was born in San Francisco on the 29th of April, 1863, the year after his parents' marriage. The boy grew up in the shadow of his father's mining empire, attended Harvard, was expelled for a series of pranks that demonstrated more energy than judgment, and returned to San Francisco with a single fixed ambition. He wanted the Examiner. George Hearst, who had hoped his son would enter the mining business, relented. In 1887, William Randolph Hearst took control of the San Francisco Examiner at the age of 23. Within a decade, the younger Hearst would build the Examiner into the most widely read newspaper in San Francisco, acquire the New York Journal, ignite a circulation war with Joseph Pulitzer that would help precipitate the Spanish-American War, and lay the foundations of a media empire that would eventually encompass dozens of newspapers, a wire service, a magazine division, a motion picture studio, and the largest private residence in the United States, the castle at San Simeon, built on the ranch land his father had purchased with Comstock money. William Randolph Hearst would become, for a time, the most influential private citizen in the country, a man who manufactured public attention the way his father had manufactured bullion, and whose methods carried consequences that neither father nor son could have foreseen. The full arc of that empire, its rise, its excess, its unraveling, and the strange kidnapping that brought the Hearst name to the attention of the 20th century for the final time, belongs to another story. It has been told elsewhere on this channel. What belongs to this story is the seed. George Hearst died in Washington on the 28th of February, 1891, while still serving in the Senate. He was 70 years old. He left an estate valued at approximately $18 million, the entirety of which passed to his widow, Phoebe Apperson Hearst. She managed the mining empire and the family finances for the next 28 years, loaned her son more than $10 million to fund his newspaper expansion, and oversaw the Homestake Mine's operations with a competence that earned the respect of the miners in Lead, South Dakota, who had never met a mine owner who visited their town, much less one who built them a library, a hospital, and a kindergarten. The Comstock gave George Hearst his start. It did not give him his method, that he brought with him from Missouri, from the lead mines of his youth, from the quartz claims of Grass Valley, from the decade of patient observation that preceded the Ophir Purchase. The Comstock merely supplied the capital and the proof. What Hearst carried out of Virginia City was a way of seeing the continent itself as a series of deposits waiting to be read, evaluated, and converted into lasting wealth. His son would apply the same logic to a different kind of deposit: public attention. The extraction method changed. The principle did not. The Bonanza Kings did not end as the men who found the Comstock had ended. They died wealthy, but they did not die well. William O'Brien, the quietest of the four partners, was the first to go. He died in 1878, barely 5 years after the Big Bonanza, at the age of 53. His health had declined rapidly in the years following the strike, and some accounts attribute his deterioration to the stress of the speculative wars that accompanied the Bonanza's peak. He left an estate of several $1 million, most of it in San Francisco real estate, and a reputation as the most generous of the four, a man who had been known to walk into a saloon and buy drinks for every person present on the grounds that he had more money than he could spend, and that the whiskey was not going to drink itself. James Flood survived until 1889. He built the Flood Mansion on Nob Hill, a brownstone palace at 1000 California Street that was and remains the only Nob Hill mansion to survive the earthquake and fire of 1906. The building stands today as the Pacific Union Club, a private institution whose members can dine beneath ceilings that were paid for with consolidated Virginia dividends. Flood also built Linden Towers in Menlo Park, an estate so vast and so expensive to maintain that it was demolished in 1936, less than 50 years after its construction. He was regarded by the San Francisco public as the most skilled stock manipulator of the four partners, and by his partners as the man who held the firm together. His reputation in the financial press was that of a man who caught investors coming and going, and he did not discourage the description. James Fair was elected to the United States Senate from Nevada in 1881, a seat purchased, as was customary in the era, through the strategic distribution of funds to state legislators who controlled the appointment. He served one term and was not re-elected. His personal life was a catalogue of scandal. His wife divorced him on grounds of habitual adultery in 1883, one of the most publicized divorces of the Gilded Age. He died in 1894, estranged from his surviving children, and his estate was contested in a legal battle that consumed years and enriched the attorneys who prosecuted it. The San Francisco press, which had once celebrated Fair as a mining genius, described him at death as a man whose wealth had purchased neither happiness nor respect. John Mackay outlived them all. He departed the Comstock in the late 1870s, moved his wife Louise to Paris, where she became one of the most prominent American hostesses in European society, and turned his attention to a new industry: telecommunications. Mackay co-founded the Commercial Cable Company and laid the first transatlantic telegraph cables to compete with Jay Gould's Western Union monopoly. He made a third fortune. He died on the 20th of July, 1902, in London, at the age of 70. Of the four Bonanza Kings, Mackay alone managed to translate his Comstock wealth into a second career of comparable ambition, and alone among them he retained the respect of the public and the press throughout his life. His statue stands today on the campus of the University of Nevada, Reno, funded by the millions he donated to the state's School of Mines. William Sharon, the bank crowd's architect on the Comstock, was elected to the United States Senate in 1875, the same year his former partner drowned. He served one term. In 1883, a woman named Sarah Althea Hill sued him for divorce, claiming that a secret marriage had taken place between them. Sharon denied the marriage. The case, which was tried in both state and federal courts, became one of the most sensational legal proceedings of the decade, involving forged documents, accusations of perjury, and a courtroom brawl in which Hill drew a pistol. Sharon died in 1885, before the case was fully resolved. His estate passed largely to his children. Adolph Sutro, the engineer who had spent 9 years and $3.5 million boring a tunnel into the base of the Comstock to drain the mines, sold his interest in the tunnel, moved to San Francisco, invested in real estate, and was elected mayor in 1894 on a populist ticket. His term was undistinguished. He spent his final years in declining health and diminishing fortune, surrounded by a private collection of books and manuscripts that he had assembled at great expense and that he lacked the resources to properly house. He died in 1898. His library, scattered after his death, was one of the great lost collections of the American West. Virginia City itself entered a decline that no amount of civic pride could arrest. The Bonanza period ended by 1880. Deep exploration continued sporadically, but the ore that remained was thinner, deeper, and more expensive to extract than the Bonanza-era deposits. The population fell steadily. The Virginia and Truckee Railroad, which had hauled millions of dollars in ore down the mountain to the Carson River mills, ran its last regular service in 1950. By 1920, the last pumps were shut off, and the lower levels of the mines flooded to the depth of the Sutro Tunnel, approximately 1,600 feet beneath the surface. Water from those mines still drains today at the mouth of Sutro's bore, a century and a half after the tunnel was completed. By 1930, fewer than 500 people remained in a city that had once held 25,000. The Opera House stood empty, the hotels closed, the shafts filled with water, and the timbers rotted in the dark. The federal government designated Virginia City a National Historic Landmark in 1961, preserving in amber a place that had consumed and discarded more capital, more timber, and more human life per square mile than almost any other site in the American West. At the most recent census, Virginia City's population was 787. 300 miles to the west, the silver's legacy is written into the physical fabric of San Francisco. The Palace Hotel, rebuilt after the 1906 fire, still stands at the corner of New Montgomery and Market. The Flood Mansion still crowns Nob Hill. The Nevada Bank, founded with Bonanza King capital, was eventually absorbed into Wells Fargo. The streets that Ralston planned, the parks that Olmsted designed at Ralston's invitation, the cultural institutions that Comstock money endowed, all remain. San Francisco was built, in no small part, with silver that was mined from a mountain in the Nevada desert by men who worked in tunnels where the water boiled. The city does not advertise this fact. The mountain cannot forget it. In the Lake Tahoe Basin, the forests that the Comstock consumed have been growing back for more than a century, but the recovery is incomplete and the damage ongoing. The old-growth stands that once covered the eastern Sierra are gone. The regrowth, dense and uniform, remains vulnerable to the catastrophic wildfire conditions that the original clear-cutting set in motion. Scientists who study the Tahoe Basin's ecology trace its current fire risk, its diminished water clarity, and its altered species composition directly to the logging of the 1860s and 1870s. The Comstock's timber hunger did not end when the mines closed. It entered the landscape as a permanent alteration, a wound that heals in the wrong shape. The Comstock Lode produced, by the most conservative accounting, more than $300 million in silver and gold between 1859 and 1878, with an additional $50 million in the decades that followed. Adjusted for the purchasing power of the era, the figure represents one of the largest concentrations of mineral wealth ever extracted from a single site. The silver was so abundant that it altered the monetary policy of continental Europe, as Germany and then France abandoned bimetallic currency standards that could not absorb the Comstock's output. It financed a civil war, created a state, built a city, destroyed a forest, ended a bank, and seeded a media dynasty that would shape American public life for the better part of a century. The men who found it died in poverty, in asylums, and by their own hands. The men who profited from it built mansions, laid telegraph cables, entered the Senate, and left estates that their heirs contested for decades. The mountain itself was hollowed, flooded, and abandoned. The pattern the Comstock established would repeat across the American West for the next half-century: the extraction of a place for the enrichment of a distant city, the transfer of wealth from the ground to the ledger, and the abandonment of what remained when the extraction was complete. The Comstock was not the first American mining boom, but it was the first to operate at industrial scale, the first to be financed by a modern banking system, and the first to demonstrate that the distance between discovery and ruin could be measured in a single generation. The blue stuff that clung to the miners' picks in 1859, the heavy clay they cursed and scraped from their sluices, turned out to be worth more than everything else they had ever found combined. It was, in the end, exactly what it appeared to be. The cost was simply higher than anyone standing on that hillside in June of 1859 could have calculated, and it has not finished compounding.